Yes, okay. All right, so I so wish that we were meeting in real space together. I feel separated from my TTISS Ontario family, but I'm glad that we're rebooting together, at least by Zoom. So as everyone knows, yesterday marked a very sad milestone in terms of the 1-year anniversary of the declaration of the COVID pandemic. We've had many millions dead, 2.5 million plus. And this is probably accounting for 4 to 5% of deaths on Earth now, with this now in third place in the US as a cause of death. So we get a nice something else to think about in this session, although something also rather serious. So I don't have any significant disclosures other than the fact that I will be mentioning the off-label use of some various salvage medications shown here on the right. So I don't have any direct links to any commercial entities, though, by which to profit. I am using innocent bystander metaphors, and I hope that they are not triggering. I'm going to be showing 3 portraits in this talk, and I am providing them as loving homage. So I've put my heart and soul and best intentions into this session, and I hope my comments and thoughts and images will be received that way. So the agenda here, we're going to go over some key basics, a case, answer some questions together. There are 3 interactive polling questions. Talk about some advances in the field, and then integrate some of these ideas together. I want to remind everybody that as adults, we each comprise about 30 trillion cells, and the commonest cell in our body is the red blood cell. So even though it's only about 2.5 kilograms of our weight, 5 in every 6 of our cells is an erythrocyte. And these essentially are like the micro lungs of our body. Their job is to exchange gases. And this is a bit of a shift in our focus because, we've been putting a lot of rightful emphasis on cardiopulmonary transfusion reactions. But obviously, I'm going to be talking about a reaction that goes back to some classic blood banking in terms of, hemolysis. So red cells on the exterior share a lot of these universal or public epitopes. We all kind of look that way towards each other, but layered on top of that, and this is a slide that's always getting updated, is the fact that we've got a tremendous amount of red cell diversity. So, as of 2021, there are over 431 known red cell antigens, at least insofar as what's known to have provoked an identified antibody. And that count probably hasn't plateaued yet because not everyone has seen every polymorphic version of themselves and tested that exposure for its antigenicity. So we're also knowing that there are more and more coding region variants the more we look. So this is the picture of human migration on the planet since hominins originated. And, the important principle here is that every migration offshoot represents a narrower genetic selection, because it's a subset of, the mother family. And therefore, going backwards, this logic implies then that origins are implied by diversity. And this is what is meant by the out of Africa hypothesis and the acknowledgement that maximal DNA diversity will be found in those with African ancestry. And what a lot of kind of high-income country research has not been addressing adequately is a true picture of that genetic diversity when it's been gated on studied populations with Western European ancestry. So this is us, and it doesn't matter, how you integrate this with different hominins that sapiens may have mated with, but the bottom line is this is how we all started. And so that means that with more time and more pressure, there are chances to change. And the foundations of diversity, the things really driving this in the base African genome, are alleles that are positively selected for because of their functional value. And the big story there is malaria. There are polymorphisms that prevent invasion by parasites, and a lot of us have learned about the value of not expressing Duffy on the red cell in terms of making it impervious to Plasmodium vivax, as well as some glycophorin twists that lead to some invasion resistance to falciparum. And then there are other blood group antigen ligands that the malaria-infected red cell likes to bind to as a way to opportunistically rosette and tack down on the endothelium to prevent blood flow into the spleen for parasite clearance. So this is a brilliant evolutionary tactic. And some of these exploited ligands are the blood group systems on the red cell. Most powerfully, the A antigen in the ABO system. There's value in being NOPS null in terms of evading some of this binding. Now, there's also the intriguing story of RH, and RH is not hyperdiverse because it has value as such. It's not like it's being selected the way snowflake unique antibodies are for different antigens. This is a structural liability. This is a gene duplication. D faces the CE gene, 5', 3', 3', 5', and this leads to this hairpin change that is conducive to gene conversion or intergenic recombinations. So you get analogous exons, kind of cassette switching. And so this is driving the diversity we see there. And so this is just a structural accident in the opportunity that time grants. Now with that, there are antigens and antibodies of concern. So the Wiener and glycophorin systems have a lot of polymorphisms within them. And that means that people with African ancestry may be more vulnerable than they seem. For our serologic reagents, it may look like they've got the antigen, and yet they're able to make an antibody against the thing that they seemingly have. And with that, there's also, oh, sorry, is my audio okay? I hear voices. Okay, so there are also wild type driven antivariant antibodies. So with the appropriate selection of people with African ancestry profiles that would be typical for someone who needs blood, for example, a patient with sickle cell, someone whose variant on the recipient side may oppose the actual wild type version of the allele that they've got and that they understand as normal. So there's a lot of interesting serology or immunogenetics here. And then there's also the story of Duffy, which, we've had a bit of a pendulum swing with. Genetics has shown us that, people who seem like they're Duffy A neg, B neg really aren't, at least differentially. They still express the Duffy B version of the ACKR1 gene, and that should bestow tolerance. And yet there's a very, very small subset of individuals with this particular genotype and phenotype where we would generally just respect the commanding Duffy A negativity, who then make these very high frequency antibodies called anti-Duffy3 that can only be bypassed with Duffy A neg, B neg blood. So anyway, this is to say that this is complicated, and this is probably why, blood banks strive to have, people who are kind of board certified in this craft so that they can counsel on some of these funny serologies. Now, going back to Mother Africa, Plasmodium falciparum has selected for many counter adaptations. Today, 1 in every 7 of us is genetically imprinted by this infection. And these gene changes bestow some severity mitigation. And the one that's probably most familiar to people as a defense mechanism is the sickle trait mutation. So this is a very successful carrier state that allows one to overcome various stages of malaria infection. And so what happens with the survival advantage of the traits is the mating opportunity of the survivors, but the price of this that nature pays are balanced polymorphisms with 1/4 odds of disease status, sickle cell, and half of offspring being the carriers. And so what this brings us to today is struggles of millions of people with sickle cell anemia as an illness, and a history of exploitation of the genetic resilience of the traits insofar as enslavement, and then racist myths further perpetuating that oppression. So this has been a tremendously tragic story in our anthropology and our history together. And so I'm not going to belabor how terrible a disease sickle cell is, but just to say that this is the genetic backdrop we're living with. And if you look at, where humans live on Earth and you shake this image up as if it's iron filings, we all know that people travel and people move. And Toronto is a very diverse city where we get to witness a true privilege, this incredible diversity. So our first task when we're transfusing individuals with these immunogenetics are 3 styles of transfusion if they have sickle cell. And there are many guidelines out there on how to manage or how to pick blood, and this is the screenshot for CBS. But generally speaking, we kind of think of matching in 3 tiers. So there's the basic match that many of us on this webinar together would get. But if somebody has a propensity to make antibodies, we may begin to do some higher fidelity allocation. So prophylactic antigen matching would be the CE and KEL added to the usual. We'll call that PAM for short. And extended antigen matching or super matching would include the KID, the Duffy, and the S and the M&S system. And then the question is, do you extend that out to M or N, as there's been this belief that glycophorin A, the M versus N variants are not that clinically significant. I'll show you some evidence that may not be true. And obviously matching for other targets if you've made antibodies against them and we know them to be significant. So in sickle cell, we do at the very least, if someone is reliably screen negative, and that's at every view that we have access to, they would get PAM. And if a sickle patient has ever made antibodies, we would give them a super match. And this is because sickle cell disease is king as the immune responder state. There is nothing that has an alloimmunization odds as high as sickle cell. And in an all-comers population, about 13% of people are thought to be responders, where every time they see a foreign antigen, there's maybe a 30% odds of seroconverting at that red cell opportunity. But what you can see in sickle cell disease is that, by your second dose or your next unit, you actually have twice that odds of making antibodies. It can be 60% per exposure. So we need to tamp that down. And that's what some of us refer to as serologic affirmative action. We're dissolving that unfair disadvantage that these individuals are beset with. And so the reasons for that immune responder pitch in sickle cell disease, I've spoken a bit to the hyperdiversity. There's also the odds that a recipient sees a donor who's got a different profile from themselves at the very basic canonical level of CE, KEL, Duffy, KID, and M&S. There's the fact that when we transfuse a sickle patient, that they're inflamed, and that means that the immune synapse is hotter. And so instead of a tolerant signal, you're going to have your co-stimulatory ligands docking to make that antigen presentation get taken more seriously. And then timing is another fascinating factor. So, the sickle cell patient is not getting transfused infancy onwards before thymic involution the way a thalassemia patient may. There's an intermittency to their chronobiology that may be provocative. There's the loss of their spleen, which may or may not have a role. And there's the fact that with this intermittency, there's no opportunity to return necessarily for repeat screening at that prime opportunity of 1 to 3 months after an immune stimulus to see if anything happened. And the fact that you've got a 50 to 70% rate of evanescence of antibodies by the end of the year. So it means we may be missing a lot of seroconversions over time. So this intermittency evanescence problem drives some of this timing fallibility. So the British Journal of Hematology has guidelines out on kind of all aspects of transfusion, but I want to emphasize this quantitative point that we really shouldn't be triggering if the hemoglobin is greater than 50 or if the drop from baseline is less than delta 20 without other symptoms or concerns toward progression. Now, Stella Chow, a superstar featured in the February issue of the ABB News last year, was the lead author on the ASH guidelines for sickle cell disease. And this was a much more nuanced document that also spoke to the kinds of matching that we should be offering, advocating for molecular testing, and so forth. So coming back to Toronto, we are a place of United Nations. And at the UHN, interestingly, so we would cast out about 40,000 units of red cells a year. The odds of a person getting a red cell at UHN having an underlying inherited hemoglobinopathy is on par with the cancer program. So we've reached parity there. About 27,000 red cells every year go into a hemoglobinopathy patient here. So that's about 1 in every 5 of our dispensations. And that 27,000 unit load is the size of some hospitals' entire inventories every year. So our sickle patients, we know, have antibodies. In this 19-year audit, we saw that about 40% of our sickle patients, despite all of this, PAM and supermatching algorithm work, have these antibodies. And of course, we're an adult hospital, so some of the time patients come to us with these antibodies already on file. But other times they may sensitize because we're giving phenotypically and not molecularly matched units, or there have been pregnancies, or there have been migrations to other jurisdictions that don't follow the guideline rules. So information is a challenge. Our patients are far more portable than their information is. And what we do to try to overcome or bridge that is card our patients. So this is an example of a blood group antigen profile that's been informed by a genotype, even though it's called a phenotype, with a list of that particular patient's antibodies on another side. So Canadian Blood Services has a sickle cell anemia registry. It's an in-house system of information that any practitioner can't just log into and see, but it is 24/7 available by phone call where an agent within Canadian Blood Services will help inform us on what this centralized data house has. And so it's got different hours of operation, or you call different people depending on what time of the day or day of the week it is. And this has moved from a paper system with a key number of phenotyped antigens to genotype-based information, lists of antibodies and so forth. And this is only as good as that giving and receiving loop is. So if a hospital has a patient who's immigrated from another country, and they're the first holder of rich information on profiles and antibodies, it would be great to forward that to the registry, because CBS can't know everything about everyone who's lived everywhere around the world and just moved here without us letting them know. So many Canadian societies are pointing this out, that this important data house exists, but the consensus statement is supporting a call for the creation of a national patient registry. And so in the United States, one example would be NPAR, where people can log in. But this is something not yet present in Canada, but something to think of. So here's a case. So young adult comes into a community hospital with a vaso-occlusive pain crisis, hemoglobin 86. With the crystalloid management, they dilute down to 67. And this leads to the triggering of a transfusion. And the profile that the hospital has is listed. So the clinically significant antigen negativities are in bold, and some of them have antibodies, and there are some not so clinically wild antigen negativities that have been retaliated against. There's a history of some antibodies, but the ones in gray are antibodies that are not necessarily known to the community hospital because they've evanesced. And so somebody else has this information. And so they know the antibodies that the patient has, but not the stuff in gray. And what happens is the patient gets 3 units of red cells over a 4-day period. They trigger at 67 to get to 74. Not happy with that, adding on to 74 on another day, get them to 84. Adding to that on another day, because they've drifted down to 78, another unit that gets them up to 98. Now, M was sacrificed as an antigen call on at least one of the 3 units. And interestingly, one of the 3 units actually had a big E positive slip through. And what happens 5 to 10 days after this exposure is the patient's hemoglobin goes to 64 to 22. And she's, can you still hear me? Okay, sorry, I just heard a voice. So the hemoglobin crashes, there's hemolysis. but then a near disappearance of the reticulocyte. So she gets transferred over to our hospital. And what gets identified in the workup of that anemia, which is about to drive another transfusion order, which then gets canceled, is the recrudescence of the anti-Duffy3, as well as the appearance of the anti-M, which had evanesced, and a new high-frequency antibody. So this is hemolysis to an extreme, obviously. And so we've got our own kind of mindset on what the criteria are for hemolysis. But this is hyperhemolysis, which is where the post-transfusion hemoglobin is far lower than what the triggering hemoglobin was. And there is a loss, an upfront loss of the involved unit. So you don't see the hemoglobin A on the hemoglobin electrophoresis that you might have done to prove the survival of the transfused blood. And instead of reticulocytosis, you see a disappearance in red cell productivity. And you may even see DAT negativity. An interesting proportion of these cases, anywhere from 1/3 to 85%, depending on the timing, may be seronegative. So I hate saying this, but it's as if some of our reagents may also be racist. By that, I mean that there are some monoclonal reagents that have been described in the literature that fail to identify not only the insignificant IgG4s, which we don't care so much about blindness toward, but some isoallotypes of IgG. So IgG3, a subclass of IgG, has some isoallotypes, for example, IgG303 and IgG313, which these reagents can't see. And if this is the kind of antibody a person has made to an antigen, your reagent may not be able to see it. And what's interesting is that these particular isoallotypes are not very well represented, so you're not going to miss much in a Caucasian. But this can represent up to 20 to 30% of the antibodies in those with African ancestry, which makes you wonder if that 38% is really more like 68%, or a much greater inflation. That 85% described in some series may have been a reagent-specific inflation. Okay, so question 1, if we can bring up question 1 from our poll. Okay, so click each of the following rare adverse transfusion effects you have seen in your practice. Have you seen post-transfusion purpura, hyperhemolysis syndrome, the entity I'm talking about, TAGVHD? Have you seen a transfusion-transmitted viral infection? Sorry, that's a double choice there. That should just be the one time. Okay, so let's see the answer. Okay, so that's fascinating. There you go. So, we do a lot and say a lot about mitigating the risks of TAGVHD. Just think of how many millions of dollars we spend for every case averted. And think of what we spend differentially to prevent hyperhemolysis syndrome. PTP is always on our list. We report it. But hyperhemolysis, if we've seen it, have we reported it? Some of our folks who've seen transfusion-transmitted hepatitis C, may have been individuals who practiced, in the time before the Crever Commission was convened. And it is shocking, at one point, the chance of getting hep C from a transfusion could have been as high as, 5 to 10%. Now the risk is 1 in 13 million. So most of us have not seen transmission of hep C in our practices if we're younger practitioners. So, hyperhemolysis syndrome, we quote the risk here as between 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000 to every sickle cell patient who gets consented to transfusion. So obviously that's a risk range unique to that subpopulation. I would not quote that risk for the average Joe Blow off the street. So overall, this is a rare syndrome. But if you belong to a group in which this is a problem, this is a germane odds you need to hear about and that you have the right to hear about when counseled. So the majority of the cases, as I mentioned, are in sickle cell. The case fatality rate can be quite high. There's a very high recurrence rate despite efforts at super matching and even non-standard of care modalities like monocyte monolayer assays. And this should be a hemovigilance reportable event. Now, how bad was her drop? She went from 98 at her post-transfusion peak down to a low of 22. So her delta was 76, which is more red cell loss than what she had when she triggered. So that's kind of hard to imagine. But we called her a grade 4 if we use the customer letter scheme of qualifying hemolysis severity, which is different from the severity scheme in TTISS for all reactions, all comers. So, was she endangered by this? Well, we know that we only use about a quarter of the oxygen that a normal hematocrit carries, but we've got an individual whose hematocrit went very critically low. You could say that 22 is a quarter of 100, and maybe she's at her critical DO2 crit for dispensing or offloading the oxygen that her vital organs need. The brain uses about a third of the oxygen that hemoglobin delivers there, but the heart, which is compensating for the anemia by beating faster, uses 2/3 at least, and under periods of high demand can have oxygen extraction ratios of 75 to 100%. So this is the organ that can infarct soonest or the most when someone is critically anemic. So we can see that by interesting surrogates of cellular asphyxiation. That's when the mitochondria are no longer engaged in their oxidative phosphorylation or their oxidative respiration at a cellular level. The more severe the anemia gets, the more you fall below your critical DO2 crit, the more you're going to see the hallmarks of not being in Krebs cycle and generating lactate from the foregoing Embden-Meyerhoff cycle. So we like to watch parameters like lactates and bicarbs in individuals to see if their anemia is getting critical. A big driver here is the complement cascade. It's super evil. And sickle cells themselves can activate complement. So when complement cascades are activated, even the endothelium, which is the next largest organ in the human body, that's the lining of every vessel, paving the way for blood to flow into every organ, can begin to die out. So you can see microvascular death happening and critical organ failures. You see a collapse of the erythroid biomass, no red cell production, and a vast consumption of the patient's own seemingly should have been compatible red cells. So this is definitely a bystander phenomenon. The management, I would hazard to say that some of these admissions would cost between $10,000 to $100,000. These patients often need critical care. They take monoclonal antibodies like eculizumab, IVIG high-dose steroids. Sometimes they're in the hyperbaric oxygen chamber. Sometimes they're getting hemoglobin-based oxygen carriers. Rituximab, stolen from the lymphoma cannon, can be used to subdue antibody production. And so the key here is anti-complement and anti-B cell therapy. So there are some celebrities in the world of hyperhemolysis. When it comes to trying to figure out how to prevent this terrible entity, this interesting scoring system has come up. We haven't formally adopted this, but I think we do this kind of intuitively. People have prophylactic antigen matching if they're low risk. We put them on extended antigen matching if they've got an antibody history. But if they're equivocal, we do a case-by-case review. If we have a seemingly screen-negative person who immigrated and we can't have access to their records, then we might supermatch them. This young individual had a score of 14 at first blush, and then we found out about a historic DHTR several years prior. And so the score there actually for this individual would have been 19. Now, this was a pretty good match in most of those 3 units, but it wasn't perfect, and maybe some antigen mismatches were the provocative stimulus. When we've looked at our hyperhemolysis cases here, she would have fit in this bin of an individual who was historically screen positive, who stayed screen positive and even developed more antibodies on top of that. But as you can see, we've got a lot of people in blue who are starting seronegative and stayed seronegative, so they continue to be a bit of a mystery. And among those who've seroconverted with new or implicated antibodies concurrent to the episode, we've had a number of M and N cases, which CBS has very kindly provided evading matches to us for subsequently. And so even though this hasn't been logged in, a lot of the phenotype profiles, there's a lot of catch up and there's some value in genotyping because this gives us the M and N types that may not be as easily determined by serologic methods. Now, what if you couldn't do a score? Are there other ways to predict if you're going to get this? Well, there was an interesting paper on some genetic propensities. I mean, odds ratios as high as 22, which is staggering. But again, these are not standard of care. So we would love to get this young individual out of this fate of possibly being retransfused and having this trigger again, because each time, there's this 1 in 5 chance she might die of the event. So, you might have to then aim for a cure or try some of these new agents. The problem with curative tactics is that they too require transfusion to support your way through. So this in computer logic is known as a deadlock situation. Okay, so let's bring up question 2. So for a patient with sickle cell disease who's currently admitted with a crisis at a smaller community hospital, whose responsibility is it to ensure that the requested blood is rightly matched? Is it the technologist in that community blood bank? Is it that community blood bank's medical director who may not have had board certification in transfusion medicine? Is it the blood operator to cross-check all separate reference lab sources of information with the order fulfillment team, which is in another department? Or is it the academic center's most familiar specialists who take remote care of the patient by aid of new communication and authorization conventions that would have disallowed transfusion triggering at certain numbers and that would have advocated for super matching when it's not normally done for anyone else with a similar antibody profile? So let's bring up your voting answers. Okay, so that's interesting. That's, it feels like a strong onus, and I would say, I'm not sure if I can close this question box. We can relieve the question box. I'm having a hard time navigating my mouse. Thank you. So I don't know the correct answer to that question. So let me ask you another, because I don't know what to say. So before that, sorry, so half of medical adverse events follow inadequate handoff. So you could say that through no fault of the patients, that not having portable antigen information is a handoff event in healthcare. What is the power of our cards to bridge and speak as a registry workaround? Is this enough? How important is it to overcome this? Okay, now we can bring up question 3. So the patient with sickle cell has developed hyperhemolysis and transfers out for complex care. Whose responsibility is it to report this case to TTISS? Is it the community hospital blood bank that issued the units that triggered the episode? Is it the receiving specialty hospital's blood bank? Is it unresolvable because only the source knows the units but doesn't know the outcome, and the receiver doesn't have the product specs but sees the clinical end? Or this should be a tag team effort by negotiation. One party uploads and the other provides all the requested information wherever there's something missing. So let's get your vote. Okay, can we see the answers? All right, I love that answer, so I would totally agree. Okay, so we can clear the question. So on the TTISS forms, we would call this an unintentional incompatible other system hemolytic reaction delayed with maybe some new antibodies forming. And, I can't speak to which ones are causal because there were so many flashing up with this episode and so many implicated antigens across the 3 units. I would say this was definitely implicated, life-threatening. Should we fill something out here in hospital procedure involved? This was the medical follow-up, and did we notify the blood center? Yes. So I took a look at the latest report at TTISS, and we all know that TACO is the most important or predominant reaction at 30%. Allergics would be next, and they get split between severe and the anaphylaxis grade. But the hemolytics just get separated out by acute versus delayed by timing and not by severity. And if we look at the 65 DHTRs, 35 of which came from sentinel sites, we can compute a red cell DHTR incidence of 1 in 16,000, where the diagnosis is pretty confident most of the time. But what's interesting is 57% of the time they're severe or life-threatening. And that's similar. It's statistically similar to the 37% that is severe in TACO. So, with the hemolytic reactions, there was a death, and 11 with major or long-term sequelae. So I don't know if this means that we should be splitting DHTR, just leaving it as such, and then detailing the HHS nature of this. So it's this, these cases make me wonder if there's an underreporting bias for delayed events. Is this the true number? Is TISS really, a pedigreed system that calls to mind acute events? And is that what we're instinctively prone to doing? It's so much going on that by the time we think of reporting, we've forgotten. Is there value in creating a distinct category? Is there value in coding for the presence of sickle cell disease, if that's the patient background for DHTR? So the value in knowing, I would say that there's a lot of performance feedback value. People need to know the cost, and if we knew the true number, we could estimate the impact. And then we could get some more information for informed consent and prognostication by having data on outcomes. So we don't get a lot of time to think in the healthcare system. But I would ask that, we take this to the next level as Jedi warriors. And by that we consider also HHS as a justice, equity, diversity, inclusion matter. So, 2020 has been a year of I can't breathe for COVID, recognition of structural racism. TISS is amazing at getting us, on this message of respiratory reactions. But this session, I hope I've convinced you, is about another kind of I can't breathe that integrates a lot of interesting cellular and system sorts of asphyxiation. So on that, I want to say that, we should care about sickle cell hyperhemolysis. By caring about it, we think about it more. We prevent it, we treat it, we report it by the tools that we have. And maybe we can improve prevention. Maybe we can do more research on this. And maybe we can consider the testable aspects of these events and advocate more strongly for registry building and refinements of the systems that we have. So thank you. I want to invite everybody to another matching seminar that's going to be run by OrbCon soon. And also remind you that there are excellent recordings of other sessions relevant to some of the concepts I brought up here in the U of T monthly transfusion rounds. So with that, I will take questions, and I'm sorry I've run a bit over time.